thing that's concerned me as an attorney for years and as a physician as well is, I always use the saying, if all you have is a hammer, all the world's a nail. And so a case that we just wrote up and I was tangentially involved in was a case where a person was in with a bad sore throat to an urgent care, drooling and hoarse voice. Now, to any EM physician, the first thing you think about is peritonsil abscess, epiglottitis, maybe retropharyngeal abscess, but the hoarse voice and the drooling, you have the epiglottitis. And it was completely missed. And, 12 hours later, the guy was dead. And when asked, he was an APC, when asked at the deposition about epiglottitis, he said, I thought only kids got that. And so there's, in some folks, a level of depth that they don't quite have because they don't have all the training that physicians have, so they don't always pick up on the nuances.
Welcome to Skin Deep. I'm Dr. Anna Chacon, and today we have a very special guest joining us. Get ready for some expert insights you won't want to miss. If you can tell the audience a little bit about yourself and start with just introducing yourself, please.
Sure, my name is John Shufeldt. I'm a board-certified emergency medicine physician, and I've been an entrepreneur for probably 30 plus years.
So I invited you on the podcast based on an article I read on Medscape. I was very impressed. If you don't mind telling our audience, who's generally a mixture of, I want to say, physicians and patients and some influencers, but tell everybody basically your trajectory after medical school.
Sure, I did a emergency medicine residency at Christ in the south side of Chicago. Stayed there for a year, kind of had two full-time jobs, one there as an academics and one in a suburban hospital. Moved out to Arizona, took a job as a medical director for an emergency department in Casa Grande. 3 years later, started the first urgent care in Arizona and one of the first ones in the country called NextCare. Went back, got my MBA at the same time, grew NextCare to 60 locations in 7 states. Along the way, had a couple of the business startups, got a law degree as well. Left NextCare in 2010, sold it to private equity. 2 weeks later, I started MeMD. MeMD was an early telemedicine company, which we sold to Walmart in June of 2021. Along the way, had a number of other startups as well. Gone back to school a few more times. And right now, a business called Tribal Health, where we staff about 50 plus Native American facilities across the country. I own a venture capital company called Xcellerant. I'm the managing partners. And I'm a partner of a pharmaceutical company called VivaMed Biopharma.
And you had your own podcast. It seems like you're constantly working on stuff and studying. How did you have time for all these things?
Emergency medicine is very shift oriented. So when I was in law school, I'd go to school during the days and work the later shift and the weekends. It's emergency medicine is relatively easy to have multi-careers.
I read in the article, and I think on LinkedIn, you still work as a physician, correct?
I did work. Yeah, I was in Eagle Butte, South Dakota over New Year's working in the emergency department.
That's amazing. And do you work in a couple ERs or one mainly?
No, we staff a number of emergency departments, and I'm always the physician of last resort. I have the ability to fly, so I can get there in a moment's notice for a lot of the places. If the physician misses a flight or is sick or something, I can go there and work.
And where are you based out of now? Where do you live now?
Scottsdale, Arizona.
And so a lot of the ERs that you kind of serve as backup for or oversee, are they tribally oriented, tribal health?
Yeah, it's all through a company called Tribal Health. And so we have probably 400 doctors and nurses that work in all these different facilities around the country.
If you can tell the audience, just as a physician, let's say your MBA and the JD was useful, or why you went back specifically to get those degrees. Mm-hmm.
Well, for the MBA, I did that first 93 to 95. And, I did not have any really business training. I've been entrepreneurial my whole life. But realized when I started NextCare, I started the EM practice group. So we had 4 emergency departments. But I really needed some business. I really needed some business background. It's a whole new language to learn. And so went back and did that full time and really enjoyed it. Loved the learning process. And then 10 years later, went back and got a law degree. And I thought at some point I, won't want to be in the emergency department on nights, weekends, and holidays. And so I defend physicians in front of the medical board, which I did for a little bit of time. Enjoyed it, but it was just not something I wanted to spend the majority of my time on.
You specialize in physician defense in front of the medical boards? Okay.
Yes. I did contract review for physicians as well.
Wow. Okay. Do you practice any law now?
I look at contracts for friends occasionally, but I don't advertise myself as an attorney. At one point I had a Shufeldt law firm, so where I would do a lot of speaking and writing, and then contract review, and then some physician defense.
And in terms of the medical board, because they can be very difficult on physicians, what advice would you have to, I guess, physicians facing complaints or in that aspect?
Well, the first thing is don't do the wrong thing. I mean, that's the easiest thing. The problem is a lot of people do what turns out to be the wrong thing with very clean hands. They don't know it's the wrong thing. It seems obvious at the time. I could tell you hundreds of stories of people where on the surface looks like it's an appropriate thing to do, and then it turns out not to be. If you do get a medical board complaint, take it incredibly seriously. If a patient makes a complaint, don't call the patient and try to explain it once it's to the medical board. Don't talk to the patient again. I'd hire an attorney to work with you, as experience with the medical board. They have the power to take away your license. Their duty is to protect the public, not to protect you, the physician. And so you have to treat it very seriously, and not everybody does. And the other thing I would say is be very candid. I mean, if you screw up, say you screwed up. Here's what you need to make it better. Here's what you've done to make it better. But definitely seek the advice of an attorney.
There are cases where, and I found that this to be really interesting when I learned about board complaints, but there are cases where you can get your license revoked and it seems like you can't ever go back to work. What advice do you have to people facing that or just learning that for the first time? And what can you do as a physician? Because we spend I felt like I spent a lifetime in school, and I probably wouldn't know what to do if that happened.
You know, there's not many things you can do if you had a permanent revocation of your license. I mean, there's certainly some things you can do, but there's not a lot. But I always like to think of ourselves as, I think physicians are born entrepreneurs because, what does it take to be an entrepreneur? It takes a lot of grit. It takes some creativity. You have to be a good communicator. You have to have a modicum of intelligence. These are all qualities that we all have, particularly the grittiness. You can't do what we've done without being, frankly, gritty as hell. And so I always like to say I'm a physician and. So it's what you decide is an and maybe your and is painting. Maybe your and is surfing. That's great. But I've had a lot of ands that were able to provide a living for myself. And I always try to look at things that I want to say kind of dent the universe, make a difference. And so I try to tend to have some kind of big ands along the way. And I failed multiple times trying these big ands. But I think as long as you have an and, it prevents burnout because now you're not a one-trick pony. Now when I go back to practice, I look forward to it because, I'll maybe do 5 shifts a month or no shifts for a couple of months. And I really enjoy going back and getting back in the swing of things and working elbow to elbow with people that, we were on the same team. But if, my advice to young physicians would be find your and, figure out what that's going to be.
In terms of starting your urgent care, how were you able to grow so quickly to all these states and 60 clinics?
Well, it was 17 years, so it wasn't all that quickly. I had 3 mortgages on the house. I worked 7 days a week. If I wasn't in the urgent care working, I was in the emergency department working or going to school. And it just sort of takes that level of grit. I started with 2 other emergency physicians. One bailed out within 2 weeks. The other guy who's been a lifelong friend said, look, I'll do one of these with you, but I don't want to do more. This is way too stressful. And so I just would build one, get it up to speed, start building the next one, get up to speed, start building the next 2, and kind of go like that. And, there's failures along the way, and I learned a lot. Back in the day, there weren't any urgent cares, so we had to convince the health plans the value, and we had to convince the patients about value and safety. So it was this first couple of years was pretty slog. Much like in telemedicine, it's 2010, no one could believe you could see a physician on the internet. And so it was, probably about a 4 to 5 year grind of getting people comfortable to doing what we're doing.
Did you use, just because we talked about how I have a private practice and it's extremely expensive, I think much more than telehealth to run an in-person business. Were you able to get funding to expand to all these places or how?
It was all debt. And mostly, where I had to sign, the house was, collateral. One time I had to sell a helicopter which I used to commute in. I had to sell a helicopter to make payroll once. It wasn't until 2008 that we had private equity back, and then I stuck around 2 more years.
Where was the urgent care, or how did you choose strategically to locate an urgent care?
Well, I learned a lot along the way. We stayed away from things like strip malls. We had corner locations with good ingress and egress, preferably at a light with great signage. Highly trafficked areas, those clearly worked the best. I owned an urgent care franchise for a while called Doctors Express. They started out in a strip mall, and the guy who ran it was this great guy, had a big patient following, but he had a patient about it because he was a great guy. When they tried to replicate that model, it didn't replicate well. So they asked me to consult, and then I ended up buying the company and then selling it a few years later.
Was it mostly emergency physicians or advanced practice practitioners?
That was all, at the time we started, it was all physicians. We sometimes had double coverage with APCs, some EM physicians, but mostly family practice physicians who had had the interest in walk-in care.
And then how do you think the landscape is changing now with, the advanced practice practitioners and versus physicians, both in hospitals, practices, urgent cares?
Clearly they feel a need. And I think in some practices, they're great for the level of care. Well, the thing that's concerned me as an attorney for years and as a physician as well is, I always use this saying, if all you have is a hammer, all the world's a nail. And so a case that we just wrote up and I was tangentially involved in was a case where a person was in with a bad sore throat to an urgent care, drooling and hoarse voice. Now, to any EM physician, the first thing you think about is peritonsil abscess, epiglottitis, maybe retropharyngeal abscess, but the hoarse voice and the drooling, the epiglottitis. And it was completely missed. And, 12 hours later, the guy was dead. And when asked, he was an APC, when asked at the deposition about epiglottitis, he said, I thought only kids got that. And so there's, in some folks, a level of depth that they don't quite have because they don't have all the training that physicians have, so they don't always pick up on the nuances. And there's many times, I'm sure with yourself too, you come up with a diagnosis that's just incredibly rare, like a cavernous vein thrombosis or something really odd that, but for your training, you would have completely missed it because you wouldn't even know it existed. And that's the one concern about advanced practice clinicians. They just don't have the level of training.
I wonder if they have to do, and I'm not sure if you know this, but maintenance of certification, because I know through AAD, I have constant questions, or the ABD, that just resurface. And now they don't have this, 10-year retake of exam. It's pretty much continuous and quarterly. But I wonder if that exists because those questions are still pretty difficult.
Yeah, I'm sure they do. I know APCs do, and I suspect nurse practitioners do as well.
And then empower emergency physicians. Was that your practice?
That was one of them. So I started out with another gentleman in 2000, and that we have now 4 emergency departments in Phoenix. I stopped practicing emergency medicine there, and I just managed a business for them.
And did you come from a line of physicians or entrepreneurs?
No, my father was a 40-hour-a-week attorney who worked for the same company for 40 years. He did not have an entrepreneurial bone in his body.
Oh, that's funny. And what about your mom and where are your parents from?
I'm adopted. So birth parents are from Iowa. I grew up in Chicago area. I'm not sure their level of entrepreneurism. But, the one thing I always credit being an entrepreneur to is I failed a ton as a kid in pretty much everything. So, one of the fears that people have about being entrepreneurial is they're afraid to fail or afraid to look stupid. And I grew up that way, looking stupid and failing. And so for me, it was just like, get up, shake yourself off and try again. It's that old proverb, fall down 7 times, get up 8. And I kind of grew up with that, just being self-taught. And so all these crazy, stupid mistakes I made, some of them a couple times, it was just like, this is a learning process. This is, if you want to be the man in the arena, you have to get covered with dust and blood and dirt and pick yourself up.
That's very true. Yeah. You kind of can't be afraid of failure. That's kind of my motto as well. What about your family with all these entrepreneurial pursuits? Do they travel with you a lot when you go to these places, or are any of them in medicine as well?
My wife's in medicine. She's an internist, but my son's a fighter pilot and venture capitalist with me. My daughter has a master's in sustainability. They're both parents, so 2 little grandkids. But no, I've been flying for 35 years, and I'll take a helicopter around Arizona, and I'll take the plane around the country when I go to work.
You fly yourself?
Yeah, I have an airline transport pilot rating, so I fly all over the place.
And did you have to, I'm guessing, go to school, get a pilot's license and all that other stuff?
Well, yeah, you start with a private pilot, and then you do an instrument rating, then a commercial pilot, then what's called your airline transport pilot. And it's just a matter of hours and steps and tests you take along the way. And same with helicopter.
I know in Alaska, let's say we have really bad weather a lot of the times. I mean, are there times that, or any sort of thing that you look at that tells you it's not a good time to fly? Or
Well, yeah, you certainly research the weather before you go, and you do a plane. You're flying a jet at 45,000 feet, so you really spend a lot of time. Looks like a commercial airline. Spent a lot of time analyzing it. I landed in Bemidji, Minnesota April 30th. It was the end of April, to the worst blizzard snowstorm I've ever landed in, where I couldn't see the runway side to side, not the length. I couldn't see the sides of the runway. And the ceiling was right at 200 feet, which is right since all the minimums. And I remember breaking out and seeing the runway. And I'm like, what the hell am I doing? So I've had a few of those experiences where retrospectively probably would have been smarter just to say, yeah, I'm not coming, or I'm going to wait.
Oh my gosh. And where do you park these helicopters, and where do you keep it?
I have a hangar office.
You kind of built it next to your house or something like that?
No, it's 10 miles away up at a kind of a not major, but pretty busy airport in Scottsdale.
Cool. That's very, very cool.
Yeah.
And then a couple of things. How did you eventually get into telehealth?
I was just working one day and thought, well, this is weird because a lot of patients I see probably don't need me to touch them. Sometimes we want to touch them, but that's another story. And a lot of it is just this communication. And it dawned on me that a lot of things can be solved that way. And then also there's a dearth of behavioral health providers. So when I originally started Me and B, I thought we'd angle it more towards behavioral health. And then people are like, never heard of that, can't imagine doing it. So then I kind of pivoted to more urgent care, since that's what I knew. And we started doing urgent care via behavioral telemedicine in late 2010. And then just grew it from there. And it was, we built out our own site. We kind of leased a system first and built it ourselves, but it was a slog. I mean, it was, we were at the time, the points after that, we were seeing, thousands of patients a day. But, initially I had a lot of licenses. I was the main provider, seeing patients 24/7 doing telehealth.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of what I do a lot of the times. But, and then were you store and forward, or was it video virtual?
No, it was all real-time video. It was not asynchronous.
Yeah, because I know that, and you took mostly insurance for both the urgent cares and the telehealth.
We did a lot of cash. It was $49.95 at the time. We also did insurance, and we also had a SaaS model. A lot of our patients were SaaS model, where they paid whatever dollars per month, but some of it was just straight out cash.
What is a SaaS model?
It's software as a solution. It just means that you're paying as you go. Subscription model. It means you're kind of paying as you go.
How did you, because one of the challenges being in private practice for me is getting on insurances. South Florida is very challenging. And I actually tried to get on insurances nationally, and I found out you need an address in every state. Now, it could be a virtual address, like a Regis, but I kind of found that out. Like here in California, you actually need an address here, like an address to put on Medi-Cal, on all these insurance, credentialing applications. How did you guys manage to get on insurance plans?
We're in all 50 states. We would have providers in those states. So they would have addresses to put on them. When we started, that wasn't a requirement, because when we started, it was cash only, because insurance wouldn't cover it. So we kind of grew along with the laws that came out about it. and sometimes try to influence those laws, since we were one of the few doing it.
And then it was purchased by Walmart. If you can go into how that happened, how that sort of marriage happened with Walmart. Do they still use it?
So no, they actually sold it recently. They dropped pretty much dropped their entire healthcare platform, both inpatient or both on-site clinics and virtual. We had been out to market, hired an investment banker who introduced us to Walmart. They went through about 8 months of due diligence, 7 months of due diligence. They were the proverbial 900-pound gorilla, and we were the little ant. But they were the consummate professionals, very hardcore, but very professional and polite, and got along with them just famously. All of our staff really went over there and worked for Walmart in their telehealth. I was a consultant with them for a year, but could not have had a better experience with Walmart. Very, very bright, hardworking people.
How about Xcellerant Ventures? Did you get into that and venture capitalism, and what do you focus on with that?
I wrote a book a few years ago called Entrepreneurial RX, The Physician's Guide to Starting a Business, with the idea being twofold. One, physicians should be entrepreneurs, and two, if you're in a practice where you can't be, then you should be investing in other physician entrepreneurs. The whole idea of the book was to start it was my lead in the start a venture capital company. So I met with two other gentlemen. One was a former dean of law school at ASU. He's an intellectual property attorney. The other is a PhD out of Yale, who's entrepreneurial, Chris Yu. And the three of us started Xcellerant Ventures. So we raised the first fund, $25 million. We've made about 12 investments so far. We're starting our second growth fund, which will be a lot larger, later stage fund, all health tech, med tech, a lot of physician CEOs. And then we have what's called an interval fund, which is one for non-accredited investors, put in smaller amounts of money, which will be an early stage fund as well.
Also, how you got into tribal health and Native American facilities and healthcare?
I just, by circumstance, I used to do a lot of flight medicine. I was medical director for two large flight companies. And the former CEO one said, "Hey, we're up at this hospital, San Carlos, outside of Phoenix. They need a chief medical officer. They just built the hospital. Would you be interested?" And I had little experience in tribal health other than taking care of indigenous patients in inner city ERs. So I flew and said, "Sure, so I'll try it." So I went up there to meet them and flew up there and fell in love with the people and the community and the hospital, and brought in and I was. It started because I was appalled at the quality of care that was provided. People generally weren't board certified. I was appalled. And so I thought, well, gosh, this is 90 miles from the fifth largest city in the country. This problem may be endemic. And so we started doing some research, and it was endemic. So we bid on a large contract in the Dakotas, in the Great Plains, won that, and then have grown since then. And it's been a labor of love. We're large and every day is a challenge, but we have ride or die staff, and they're all very mission driven.
Is there a role for dermatologists there? Because I'm always interested. At one point, I did want to be a dermatologist, kind of like you are, that goes to a lot of tribal facilities. In fact, what fascinates me a lot is their culture. It's just such a pretty culture, and they're usually in really remote, pretty areas, like beautiful areas that, are actually hard to get to, but really, really pretty.
Yeah, I mean, some of it's not all that pretty. A lot of these folks live in very, very rough environments, and things that we take for granted, they don't. They live in food deserts. They have a high incidence of diabetes secondary to their diet, high incidence of substance abuse, because the unemployment rate's 70%. There's not a lot to do. And then they have all things to go along with them. So they're a wonderful population to work with. They have some medical problems that they don't deserve to have. And that, one of the things that we try to do is do whatever we can to help lighten the load.
And how do people present a venture, just wondering, to Xcellerant Ventures? How does that work with someone that has an idea and then just presents it to your company for investment?
They can go on our website and fill out a form. It's just xcellerantventures.com, and it's XCELL, Xcellerant Ventures. we invest in companies that are, if it's a device, they should be near or post FDA approval. They should be pre-revenue. We don't do much pre-revenue things, so they have to have some revenue coming in the door. So it's got to be more than an idea. I've worked with a lot of providers on ideas that they've gotten to the point, then we invest in them. But generally speaking, we invest in post-revenue, post-FDA.
Is there a lot of investment in virtual care, or where do you see virtual care heading?
Virtual care is, it's like urgent care. It had its time. It's kind of come and gone. Virtual care is kind of the same way. We'll always have virtual care. We'll always have urgent care. But the time to invest in it was years ago. Hard to invest in it today. There's very little new that's coming along in virtual care. We've invested in a number of AI companies that help with diagnosis and data aggregation, but there's not too much left to invest in virtual care.
Well, thank you so much. And then I don't want to take too much of your time because I know you're probably very, very busy, but thank you for joining me. And I really look forward to, we should keep in touch. So if you ever need a dermatologist in tribal health, I would love to be that dermatologist.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Shufeldt.